Lesson 4.1 on triangle sum conjectures. Now let's begin today's lesson by gathering some facts that we're going to need for some deductive reasoning. Recollect from the previous chapters, first, what the measure of a straight angle was. Whenever we drew a straight line and considered that to be an angle, then the measure of that straight angle was 180 degrees. Fact number 2. What do you remember about corresponding angles? Remember, corresponding angles are two angles that are formed along a transversal when we have parallel lines. Now, corresponding angles, these angles in the same position along the transversal, along parallel lines, are congruent. In addition, one more fact that's important. What do you remember about vertical angles from Chapter 2? Vertical angles are two angles opposite each other when two lines intersect. Vertical angles are also congruent. Now, for today's lesson, these three facts that we've established from previous chapters will play an important role in deducing a new conjecture. So here's the deductive reasoning at work. Let's start with the following premise. Let's say that we have these two parallel lines cut by this transversal. What do you remember about these corresponding angles? We just discussed it from the last slide. These corresponding angles are congruent. In addition, what do you know about these corresponding angles? Let's say that I add another transversal that goes through that same point of intersection, and now we have two new corresponding angles. Well, just like the previous two corresponding angles, these angles are also congruent. And finally, what do you know about these vertical angles? Well, these particular vertical angles, just like any other vertical angles, are also congruent. Now study that diagram for just a moment. Break it up into two pieces. The first piece is above that top line there. You see these three angles. And these three angles, angle 1, angle 2, and angle 3, together form a straight line with their angles. These three angles are supplementary, and therefore they add up to 180 degrees. But notice from our little experiment that we've been doing that these three angles, 1, 2, and 3, are all congruent to these other three angles down below in this triangle. So, since these three congruent angles belong to the triangle, what is the sum of the measures of these three angles inside the triangle? If we know that angles 1, 2, and 3 add up to 180 degrees, and that these three angles inside the triangle are congruent to those three angles 1, 2, and 3, we can therefore conclude that the angles inside a triangle also add up to 180 degrees. So, from this reasoning, we can deduce an important conjecture. And that triangle is called the triangle sum conjecture. The sum of the measures of the angles in any triangle equals 180 degrees. That's in any triangle. Given any triangle, those three angles, angle 1 and angle 2 and angle 3, added together must add up to 180 degrees. Now, we can also deduce through a little additional stretch the third angle conjecture. The third angle conjecture says that when we are given two triangles, if two angles in one triangle are congruent to two angles in the other triangle, then the third angle in each triangle must also be congruent to each other. So for example, if we start with the premise that angle 1 is congruent to angle 4 and angle 3 is congruent to angle 6, then we can conclude that angle 2 must be congruent to angle 5. Thus concludes today's lesson.